Every architect recognizes that Fallingwater is a masterpiece. The American Institute of Architects voted it the most significant building in the last 125 years.
I think it's quite possible for people to come here and look at the house with absolutely no intellectual or philosophical or aesthetic or architectural preparation, whatever.
So I think that when you walk into this house, something grips you. It's not just a house in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. It's part of a total philosophy and a total way of life.
A sense of space. Nothing is more important, and that is the sense of the new architecture, the space within. That's the new thought that we call organic architecture, and to which I have devoted my life.
Deep in the woods, the only sounds to be heard are the sounds of nature. But here, in the Laurel Highlands of western Pennsylvania, among the wild flowers and rhododendron, stands a work of art. It is the most famous of 20th century houses. It has been called the best-known private house built for someone not of royal blood in the history of the world. Frank Lloyd Wright designed this house, and he called it Fallingwater. The story of Fallingwater begins with the Edgar Kaufmann family. Lillian and E.J. Kaufmann owned a department store in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1934, their son, Edgar Jr., returned home from studying art in Europe. A friend recommended that he read Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography. He became so impressed with Wright's philosophy that he went west to study with him, joining a select group of apprentices in Spring Green, Wisconsin. He introduced his parents to Frank Lloyd Wright at the very time they were thinking of building a new weekend retreat in the mountain woods they loved. Edgar Kaufmann Jr. remembers those times.
When my parents invited Wright to visit the property with the idea that he might design a house for them, they took him around the property and explained why the existing house was insufficient and no longer very happily located. And they also took him down to the waterfalls here and explained that a lot of the family's time, and of course their guest time as a result too, was spent basking on the flat rock at the base of the falls, walking in under the falls, getting a massage, sliding down into the pothole, and having fun. The falls, including the drama of the water movement and the charm of the noise that it made, was something that everybody appreciated. This was a focus of activity. Wright took that in. He didn't make any comment. Eventually, when he designed the first scheme for the house, which was also really the last scheme for the house, he placed it, as we all know, directly above the waterfall, which I don't think had ever crossed my parents' minds. Wright seemed to have been particularly fetched by these enormous rock ledges that had broken off and allowed the water to fall, and that were such a visual feature of what remained. Because you not only saw the water falling over them, you saw the ledges extending, you saw the difference in vegetation at the bottom and vegetation on the upper level, and he saw in this a tremendous opportunity, I think, for architecture not only to work with nature, but to almost become part of nature.
leak that we were talking about was occurring in this area. The wall that we talked about that it was coming through is in here, and this is what I think we have to ask.
Louis Astorino, when he first saw it as an architectural student, was inspired by Fallingwater. Now, his architectural firm has been commissioned to make the first precise drawings of the house. Wright's plans existed, of course, but until these drawings, there were no accurate measurements of exactly how the finished house matched his plans.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. The genius of Fallingwater, from my point of view, is its siting. If you see the site, it's in a lovely wooded area with a stream through it and a waterfall. The natural tendency that any ordinary architect would do would be to site the house looking at the waterfall. And in fact, I think probably Mr. Kaufmann Sr. felt that that was the logical place to put the house himself. But that wasn't a good enough solution for Wright, because he felt that any solution had to do two things. Not only did it have to look good, serve an aesthetic function, but it also had to work well. By siting the house on the southern slope, it now worked because every room could receive sunlight. It also put the house on top of the waterfall. And what a unique way to view a waterfall.
Come on.
Are you insinuating you would fall over if Bob leaned against it?
It was in the fall of 1982 that the Pennsylvania Society of Architects organized a reunion of apprentices who had worked on the construction of Fallingwater. And so, 48 years after he had discovered Wright's autobiography, Edgar Kaufmann Jr. welcomed their return to the Laurel Highlands. An early apprentice to Wright and one of the structural engineers was Wesley Peters. The first on-site apprentice was Bob Mosier, who began the construction and took it up to the second floor. And from there, through to the finish, the on-site apprentice was Edgar Taffel.
Mr. Wright, whom we shall always refer to as Mr. Wright, which is Frank Lloyd Wright, out of deference and honor, had come here to this very site. And the shortest possible story about it is that he walked through these glens and the gulches and the riverlets and so on, and went back to Taliesin, and he had ordered a site plan of this whole area. And that Mr. Kaufmann furnished him. And he was to then start to design the house and make the location for the house. Mr. Wright was in constant touch with Mr. Kaufmann, and finally, Mr. Kaufmann called one day, and it was early in the morning, and the plot plan was lying on the drafting table. And Bob and I were in the drafting room. And we heard him on the phone talking with Mr. Kaufmann, and he said, "Oh yes, E.J., come along." Well, he sat down to draw.
It was rapid fire, so it just poured out of the, I'd say, he was cooking on simmering on a back burner upstairs here for perhaps a long time, because every line that was drawn was perfectly natural. There wasn't any hesitation.
And he was just drawing first the first floor, the second floor, and details, and a section, always a section to the building. And he had this totally in his mind. He knew how it fit in here. He knew the relationship of the waterfall to the glen, to everything. And he got then the third floor, and then he did one elevation. And what I've told you lasted about 3 hours. It's about 130 miles from Milwaukee. And suddenly, then at the end, he drew big lines at the bottom. His titles were always big. Fallingwater, a house for Mr. and Mrs. E.J. Kaufmann, Mill Run, Pennsylvania, Frank Lloyd Wright, architect. And of course, I may be romanticizing it in retrospect, but nevertheless, at that moment, Mr. Wright's secretary came in and said, "Mr. Wright, E.J. Kaufmann is here, Mr. Kaufmann is here." And Kaufmann came toward the drafting table, and Mr. Wright got up and lifted up his hand and said, "E.J., we've been waiting for you."
You had the combination of a great owner, a great client, who was appreciative and cooperative with the architect, and a great architect who was appreciative and cooperative of the owner's direction, and at the same time involved on a unparalleled natural site.
When he designed Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright was almost 70 years old. He had already lived several lives as an architect. He was still being discovered for his brilliance and then rejected for his maverick ways and wild ideas. Now, in the 1930s, he was out of fashion. He had built little for the better part of a decade. Once called America's single most important architect, he was reduced to the rebel with no worthy cause. Back in the late 1920s, he had established a unique school of architecture, a place where apprentices could study and learn his philosophy firsthand. He built the school and his home on the brow of a hill and took its name from his Welsh heritage, Taliesin, shining brow. There in Wisconsin and at Taliesin West in Arizona, Frank Lloyd Wright taught the principles of his practice and inspired belief in his new architecture. Now, almost 70, he was ready to begin again. Ahead of him lay 20 years of productive creativity, and in that lifetime, he would introduce many more revolutionary ideas, like the Marin County Center in California, the Beth Shalom Synagogue near Philadelphia, and the Guggenheim Museum in New York City.
Every great building has a great idea behind it. And if you are studying architecture, you will remember and get the symbols of these buildings, the Parthenon, the cathedral at Chartres. And that photograph of falling water keeps coming up. The idea here is a wedding between various ideas, various emotions, various materials, and a piece of difficult and wonderful landscape. It's tied into the rock on this side. It opens up on the other side. To be in here in the winter and the snow is coming down. To be here in the fall when the leaves are falling. Each year, each time of the season has a different implication.
Fallingwater had a rather special function. It was a vacation house for people who lived in a city, worked in a city. My mother worked as well as my father. And the whole idea was it was something to give their lives a balance. It wasn't their home, it was the aspect of their life that augmented what they did during the body of the week by giving them an immediate relationship with nature. A simple example of how the house helped them in this weekend and vacation relationship lies, let's say, in the windows in the front of the living room. It's a strip of ribbon windows, and they look out on a hillside. You don't see the bottom of the hill, you don't see the skyline. You don't even see the bottom of the vegetation. You don't see the roots of the trees or the plants. You see a panorama of plants, and you see them in a very precisely framed relationship, which doesn't depend on whether one tree survives or not. this relationship to nature is still dictated and given a certain clarity by the framing. And then it's given a certain rhythm by the division of that frame into regular spaces, so that as you look out, you're seeing nature given a human scale.
Fallingwater gave the Kaufmann family a special relationship to their beloved woods. Edgar Kaufmann Jr. remembers how much his father loved the out of doors.
My father was indeed a nature buff. Anything that was natural and living appealed to him forever.
Frank Lloyd Wright appreciated that love of nature and responded.
And I said, why not build your house here? Inhabit the place that you love. So we built a house, that spot he loved, on the stream, and there he lived.
The plans were completed and construction began in the spring of 1936. There were no newsreel photographers to record the event. Fallingwater was destined to make architectural history, but only an amateur photographer was there to document its beginnings. While Wright's apprentices represented him at the site, a local contractor oversaw the concrete and stone construction work. The stones were cut from an old quarry just west of the falls. All of the labor was by local workmen, and both contractor and crew had to be quickly trained to Wright's ways. Some of the local experts, however, were not confident about the wisdom of Wright's bold design.
When my father received the blueprints from Wright of the house, he naturally discussed these with friends of his in Pittsburgh, including many who are engineers. And some of these engineers were extremely doubtful about the viability of the structure and also of the possibility of placing such a heavy element directly on the piece of rock that it was meant to go on. So that he then asked for more complete studies of the problem and got lengthy reports, all of which tended to show that the house couldn't conceivably stay upright, and that his money would be down the drain and he would ruin the landscape and everything would be disaster. And he mailed these to Mr. Wright, and he got back a very brisk stroke of lightning, which said, "You are not worthy to have a house of mine if you believe in this junk," or words to that effect. My father agreed that this was true. So he wrapped up the reports, and they were duly buried in one of the stone walls that was going up at that time, and future archaeologists can have a circus. Of course, by that time, the house will indeed have fallen down. So there's no telling who's going to win.
Now here we have this marvelous concept of building a home over a waterfall. But there are some practical problems to it. In fact, how do you do it? Normally when a house is built, you build a foundation, and directly above the foundation is the remainder of the house. Well, if you do that on our site or on this site, the house wouldn't work. Because part of it had to be cantilevered over the waterfall, part of it had to extend over the waterfall. So Wright employed a means which we call a cantilever. He built the foundation, and then on top of the foundation was another beam that stuck out above and over the foundation. And it's not unsimilar to a diving board. On top of that beam, then, much more structure rested, such as the chimney masses, to help really secure that diving board. And you can see that beam really becomes pretty solid. Wright used this method 4 times in the foundation of Fallingwater. There are, in fact, 4 of these piers, as I said, 1, 2, 3, and 4. First one being stone, the other 3 being a combination of stone and concrete. They became the main support system for the entire house. We then take, on top of those piers, and we add the main floor. And as you can see, we have the 4 beams resting directly over the piers, which becomes now the foundation for the main floor of the house, the living room of the house. Fallingwater has been designed and constructed of 4 basic materials. Stone, which was quarried locally on the site. Concrete, very organic material. Steel, largely showing up in the reinforcing of the concrete, but also evident in the frames of the windows, and glass. Basically your 4 materials. Wright invented the casement window. which opens from the side. In his use of the casement window in Fallingwater, when you open up the windows on the corner of a building, you expect to see a post. But because of the cantilevers, they're not needed. So when that window is opened up, nature just takes you over, and it's just a marvelous experience. Whenever the opportunity arose to orient a house on a site that wasn't a restricted city lot of sorts, Mr. Wright always liked to take his T-square, lay it on the east-west line, this being east, this being west, and then work with a 30-60 degree triangle. What I have is a floor plan of Fallingwater, and we tested the theory in our office of wondering whether or not it worked in this particular case. Put the T-square on the east-west line, took a 30-60 degree triangle, laid the hypotenuse across the T-square, and then found that, in fact, all the edges of the house lined up exactly to the edges of the 30-60 degree triangle. By doing this, this oriented the house exactly as Mr. Wright liked it, so that the sun would appear in most of the rooms.
In addition to these innovations, there are other signs of the genius of Frank Lloyd Wright. The house itself is anchored to a boulder, one of the very boulders on which E.J. Kaufmann would lie in the sun and listen to the falls. Wright made that boulder the hearth and heart of Fallingwater. Frank Lloyd Wright designed all of the furniture to echo the house. Sofas cantilever from the walls, and the low seats and tables have edges that extend like balconies. The basic color scheme of Fallingwater was selected by Wright. It shows his fondness for the warm earth colors of the American Southwest. Cherokee red became Wright's signature. Even his car was painted Cherokee red, as was the huge grog kettle at Fallingwater, and all of the metalwork in the entire house. The stone walls of Fallingwater are laid up to match the strata of natural stone from the surrounding area. Stones in the floor are waxed to resemble the bed of the stream. The great architect's design never forgets the setting. The living room opens to the stream below. Here, a stairway lets in the sound of the falls and provides ventilation. It is the final link that weds the house to the stream.
What influenced your father to go to Mr. Wright? Just
Me.
You?
That's only was the initial influence. Then they really clicked, and then
In
I didn't have any role to play
1963,
after that.
Edgar Kaufmann Jr. gave his family home in the surrounding woods to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy.
Some of them were
It was to become a public trust.
and some of them belonged to a friend of ours.
Since then, over 1.5 million people have visited the site. Some have a particular interest in architecture, but most are just curious to see the house on the waterfall.
Don't you ever get the urge to come back and just
Here I
try
am.
and... I understand. I mean, just take a summer vacation here.
You can't take a summer vacation with people like you around.
Fallingwater changed the way the world thought of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was once a figure from the past. Now again, he was the innovator. Fallingwater also changed the life of Edgar Kaufmann Jr. The house was acclaimed from the very beginning, and the Museum of Modern Art mounted a special exhibit in 1938. Afterwards, Kaufmann joined the museum staff and went on to teach architectural history at Columbia University. He hasn't lived in the house on the waterfall for over 20 years, but he continues to visit because it is a place full of memories. Of the waterfall before the house, and now of the house forever atop the waterfall. Memories of early morning dips in the stream, of quiet times and happy times, memories of his family, and of a 70-year-old architect with the very newest of ideas, who once designed a special house that would reveal its beauty from every perspective and in every detail. He remembers how in this house the sun came into his room each morning. Fallingwater, the house that was his, the house that he gave to the future. Today, Fallingwater lives among the trees, open to the air and sky in perfect harmony with nature. The house on the waterfall that Frank Lloyd Wright designed to be a home in the deep forest. Fallingwater shines like a lantern in the dark wood, the generous legacy of a great architect.
Architecture is essentially human. It is the human spirit manifesting itself, because when a man builds, there you've got him. You can't hide. You know what, who, and how that man is.
This program is made possible by a grant from Domino's Pizza Incorporated, providing 30-minute pizza delivery from our 4,000 locations throughout the United States and 9 foreign countries. Additional funding was provided by the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects.